All right, I'm starting to record now because I forgot to record earlier. So for people who are watching the recording, you just missed the 1AC, but it will be in the Google Drive folder. So you can just flow it from there. Now, in terms of questions for the students, why do you think that the 1AC reads a card that says deterrence is effective now? And you can just unmute yourself and talk.
Uniqueness.
Yeah, exactly. Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, so like deterrence is stable now, so then the plan would create like a unique impact in the status quo.
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't really matter if like laws undermine deterrence if deterrence already is unstable. Exactly. What are the strategic benefits and costs of reading like a plan that specifies a country like China?
It opens himself up to T.
Yeah, so you're more susceptible to T arguments and arguments about how it's not good to specify a country. So that's one thing to consider, definitely. What are other things to consider if you're deciding whether you want to read a specific AF?
It takes away some net ground because they can't read all of their like whole res dissets.
Good. So, well, one cost might be you're more susceptible to T. A benefit is that you can avoid like core negative ground because disads about why all countries getting laws or eliminating laws would be bad don't apply to you. Anything else? I would say one other benefit in addition to less disads linking is that you also don't have to deal with individual country picks. So if someone can cut like a really niche pick about why one specific country keeping laws are good, that doesn't matter if you only defend one country to begin with. And another cost on the flip side of that is that you're obviously able to solve less in the same way that neg has less ground, you do too. You can't like give general reasons for why laws are generally bad. And so like some of the cards in this app might even talk about why both US and China laws are bad. I'm not sure. And so that is something that to keep in mind if you're only limited in one country's laws. And you also don't get to get solvency off of things like international treaty verification measures or things like that. Any other thoughts on the app that people want to ask questions about? Okay, we can begin cross-ex then.
All right, let me pull up the time. All right, are you good? The first internal link seems to be about AWS systems generally. Where do you think it specifies the China internal link?
Wait, what do you mean? Like the Johnson evidence?
Yeah, the first one about preemption.
Okay, so a few things. Number one is that like obviously there are countries other than China who are developing laws. Our argument is that China is on the forefront of doing so with the like intention of leapfrogging the United States military capability, and also just like the status quo international order is a rules-based international order that is created and sustained by American unipolarity, which we think should be preserved.
So I'm asking less about the hedge internal link. I'm asking more about the miscalc scenario from the Johnson evidence about like AWS just like misfiring, miscalculating, and drone swarms taking away a second strike credibility.
Well, yeah. So the argument that we're making is that the country that is most likely to do so and will do so in the most recent future will be China.
Okay.
Like they are developing more quickly, and therefore they will use them preemptively.
Okay, cool. That makes sense. The Brock evidence, it's the line before it says Russia will not achieve this automation goal is like an entire line about like an entire paragraph about why Russia has developed AI systems, is prioritizing it as part of a political strategy, investing significant R&D funds into it. So what is then the warrant as per why they will not achieve the automation goal?
I think that's like less important than like the broader thing that we're arguing. So like it seems like the question that you're asking is like, why is Russia not as much of a threat as China? And I think that there are like a bunch of reasons for that. So number one is like, you know, obviously we have like other lines past that line about like how China has announced that they will be using LAWS, how they treat those things. So like, even though Russia is like, we will robotize like some of our military, it doesn't mean like LAWS. It just means that there's like some automation. Secondly, is that only China is a rising power who is attempting to create competing spheres of influence with the United States. Russia's economy has kind of been in the toilet for the past like 20 years since like the Cold War ended. And broadly, they're just kind of looking to like track on to another great power. They're kind of like sinking to become a middle power is kind of what our evidence is indicating.
That makes sense. I guess the part that I'm confused about then is which piece of evidence do you think substantiates that banning laws for China is able to reassert American dominance in the context of hard power?
Okay, I think we have several pieces of evidence of that. So the first one is that China's attempt to have LAWS dominance is to create an asymmetry in a hard power battle with the United States, which we think that the plan, you know, decreases. That's one reason. I don't know why my timer was so loud. I have a few more if you want to take prep, but we don't have to.
I'm okay.
Okay.
All right. Cool. Are you good, Alexander? Sure. Cool. First off, as topicality states is plural. Merriam-Webster. No date states is plural. Plural means more than one. Lexico no date plural denoting more than one in a number. And lethal topical weapon system bans requires multilateral consent as CRS 20. International community examines laws under a CCW multilateral arms control agreement to ban specific weapons. State discussed and adopt a final report by consensus. CCW's considered proposal to ban laws. State have not reached a consensus. I'll insert a table parties that need to reach a consensus. Violation of the plan only fiat that China bans laws for my interpretation. One, predictably, our evidence defines bans in the context of lethal topical weapon system, context of word shape meaning and research, but it's the reason I know a hot dog is a sausage with bread rather than a warm pet. Second, real world education, none of the topic literature is used as unilateral ban, and also a discussion happening in multilateral forums like the CCL. Third is limits their interpretation, open the floodgates open to infinite process of purpose. The purpose can specify any country defendant infinite mechanisms to prohibit a weapon. Each country act gets multiplied by the myriad of different legislative processes they could use to justify a ban. Fourth, negative ground, generic like AI, winter, decide politics, conventional shift treaties, decide relation, decide armed patrol, K, etc. All don't link to an affirmative. Fiat to unilateral action. Affirmatives can shift the terrain of negative offense that unfeverly favors the affirmative. Infinite prep means that the affirmative will always be ahead on whatever specific decided prep 30 minutes before the round. TVA states ought to ban lethal weapon system with a China advantage. And secondly, states ought to ban lethal weapon system in China. Briefal to competing interpretation, reasonability is arbitrary and by judge intervention back, and also back the question of winning under limiting good and C are often proves that they are reasonable. No, RBI's one is illogical. You shouldn't win for defending the topic. B is baiting. They'll be theory and just prep and out justifies infinite abuse. The K. The one is the inventions, the onto-politics of designs, and the man to see the world for what it is instead of what it must be there. The death of politics culminating in Promethean warfare. That's Duffield. 90 people, technical adjustment to shape future society. Conscious Prometheus, how world trapped in spiral with technological lassitude, suitable anti-hero, the onto-politics design principle, the caretaker society at the death of politics as well. The Promethean pictures of World War II and the Cold War were horrific. The drive for industrial mastery, they did not call for the ecological crisis. Humans basically worse the enemies now. Human behavior itself, they ignorance of the war and terror lies and choosing to outlaw set of behavioral pattern, create a timeless precarity. They reinforce the military-industrial con, logic, cementing and controlling the extinction condition for bonds that talked about. That's Krauss. 12 are control technical problem bomb itself is linked to the entire function of the MIC, not in opposition to the progressive acceptance of the underlying rules of the game. Are control regulating the type number of types that are used certain types of arms, reinforce sovereign state power, political acceptability, keep the claim to operate in the same policy frame, arms control promise to achieve the national security goals is unable to make a leap to disarmament to create a form of international order that renders the entire population multiple nuclear holocaust and even no security. The very survival of the entire population. Our response control made our proxy was more possible by creating escalatory fabric. The alternative is philosophical and humanism fragments the monocultural relationship, the affirmative statutes towards technology and techniques in favor of new diversity. That's we 19. The news is fragmentable due to being inorganic and is becoming organic. That's to consider different costs for techniques. What has to look beyond functionality? What should compare particular technology, but practical society, human is the unknown. Sensibility, the condition of diversity, underlying different epistemics or different sensitivities exist in relationship to consequence. We await that sensibility always there in all of us. You provide a new framework and a new pieces of technology, a little bit of possibility to open up by a new technological epoch. How can we think in terms of determinism instead of determinism? Our interpretation as a judge should evaluate the what is seen as a scholarly artifact. The affirmative should defend its epistemic orientation to the human machine relationship prior to valuing
a risk of affirmative solvency. Both sides of the laws debate presume a bound form of necroethics. It indoctrinates a voluntary military paradigm. Their version of the topic locks in dogmatic engagement around the normative terms of debate. Only my interpretation forces questions of human-machine relationship, which is a prerequisite to any topic education. Often Schwartz. 16. Current debate on lethal autonomous weapon systems. One side narratives robot gone wrong. Same time drive to push AWS among military decision makers. Contrast the debate relate to a deeper problem concerning technology, the future capabilities and use of AWS are a matter of speculation. Autonomy, rewrite the role and involvement of humans. The underlying question is shift from whether it's ethical to kill to whether machines can do the killing better than humans did. Large enterprise targeting killing operations conducted by CIA, the necroethics and banding fundamental issues focusing on purely numbers. The speculative nature of AWS remains uncertainty and massive uncertainty, making warfare safe. Illusion, nature of autonomous weapons, ethics becomes purely technical, includes deeper engagement rather than risk elimination. To understand what ethical responsibility entails, we must question and interrogate the human-machine relationship prior to surrendering to historical technophilia or technophobia and paradigm compatibility. Decide New Orleans, Rabinakis 17, and practice these engagement of the others to be heard around the arms trade to debate the merits, radicals, views where within an organization yet could not be translated into policy reach on peer relations and nationalism is too far removed from policy debate paradigm. Compatibility, academics or discipline and wanting to be seen as respectable, always on their term shot through with power relations. An expert was not disconnected to a political terrain rather than valorizing research useful to say policy. The criterion could be whether research holds civil society to account. The advantage. Specific edition of technological denial, reinforcement, monopoly of violence. Cooper, 18. North defeated imperialism, the arms debated territory by optimism, implemental critical IR, campaigns extract specific initiatives on individual weapons at one time at a time route to anti-military. The success of discrete initiatives and be depicted as the devil's bargain, protective of some people from some weapons is cheap, and at the expense of legitimizing other ways of war. Colonialist governmentality, arms control, technology, now laundered as the new standard of civilization monster and bans failed on the Cairo. 17. Ban looks like treaty, the model UN resolution, have it by verification, tricky, heat, turning it to a nuclear hybrid, the completed destruction of nuclear weapons, reports of use weapons have continued to emerge. Want to see Bartlett could see the uniqueness question is totally unknowable. Independent reason to reject the team for ethics. They take their authors claim out of context, drop them for deterrence because otherwise the no drawback to miscutting card. I want to see Bartlett 611. China weapons are about to practice and how we should compare China with America's recent 2.7 billion unveiling a huge unmanned ship. There may be no single answer. It is difficult and Chinese tech leadership isn't threatening. Leon Trollo 70. China leader in developing a regulatory environment to mitigate the downside. Chinese government has shown strong track record. China will be in the front of developing a regulatory regime and commonly forced that an approach reflecting a broader model of governance ideology prefers for state-centered approach and initiative put China at the forefront of developing a global approach. 20 see Johnson 20 did not stop Johnson about extended AWS causing preemption, but they only banned China AWS, so China could still preempt in the event that US has AWS and bans don't solve perception and cheating something. No risk of immature development towards it all. 19 contrary media high AI impact on war models could go for war for political reasons. Accident of war having been more than reality. Where does firstly to content development or deployment prohibited laws could unlikely resolve this fear. Was still exist laws that make those regulation harder to implement, increase the risk of cheating occurs, and swarms are loaded, no risk char. 17 Jones could defeat any countermeasures the far side of defeated by something as simple as trigger wire. Any weapon that is can be defeated by a net isn't a weapon of mass destruction. And want to see Brock Russia thumbs into rehighlighting it, into rehighlighting the want to see evidence key to maintaining evidence quality and creating a strategic disadvantage for reading poor evidence too. Young say China war inevitable. To quote from a retired ostracized Chinese general who is stating what he believes he retired in 2003 and no longer part of a military strategy, and it never says that China would first strike. So it laws given the context of the quote is defending from a U.S. invasion, which proves defensive realism, and China's peaceful differences. 19 limited predation not outright push to challenge the U.S. and it is China's game to avoid conflict. China's decision Carter rule coupled with effort to reassure and engage the U.S. to avoid competition. Chinese policy focus on co-op. She underlined these are there is hardly evidence China's big up to focus on hegemonic competition. China's neither aware of risk of taking a confrontational stance. Want to see for force that too many all cultists insert the reality of want to see force at 19 and want to see brand China's already developed conventional options to stop the U.S. and the internal about soft power, not hard power. Insert reality of want to see brand 20 and military superiority. That nothing can reverse the trend. Shallow 20 liberal on uncontested military superiority. U.S. opponents the talent every debate. U.S. are no longer able to operate in land, sea, air, nor outer space and cyberspace technology and asymmetric strategy. Limited U.S. military capabilities targeted safeguard forces, navigate seas, control communication, and protect homeland. Nothing is likely to reverse the trends. 20 Talmadge concludes negative says wars unlikely and states conventional. Insert rehighlighting the war evidence. They don't solve. It's about deterring Russia, North Korea, and around the planet. Only affect China to don't increase U.S. military. Actually, skip the second point. Omnicheck. Seriously, you don't develop new joint forces. Insert the rehighlighting of the Omnicheck evidence. The spider and winter evidence is incorrect. Nuclear winter reps are bad. Joining me 87. Actually, skip the joining me part. We're chill.
Alex, were there things you were wanting to ask before I do cross-ex?
No, I DM'd you. I'll ask the questions after cross-ex this time.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see
Okay.
that. That's my bad. Okay. You good? Okay. What does a diverse relationship to technology in the context of lethal autonomous weapon systems look like?
So it's one that would prioritize a coexisting relationship rather than one of control over technology. The argument
Right,
is
how do we coexist with technology that's built on militaristic data?
Well, the argument is not so much about data, but the reason for why laws are instrumentalized in a violent way is because of the way that humans have decided to use laws for violent ends, i.e., the implementation of them into national security strategies, et cetera, et cetera. A process of inhumanism is an epistemic reorientation that prioritizes understanding of not using technology as a tool for humanity, but something that we're inhabited towards and have affective relationships with and against.
Okay, so I hear you on all that. I'm asking what is the connection between that and like what we do with LAWS? It's like obviously like we both know what it is. It's like a thing, we input data, we turn it on, it targets, selects, and fires on its own. What is a diverse relationship to that tool specifically? You're like, we could use AI differently. I agree. How can we use laws differently?
Well, I think one, it begs the question of whether or not laws should be utilized in a national security framework, right? Which is what the alternative would disagree, right?
I'm asking how else can they be used?
I don't think we have to make a prescriptive claim about how they would be used, because our very premise is that the using of laws is problematic because it assumes human mastery over such.
Okay, got it. I want to talk about sort of the link arguments. The Krauss evidence says that international treaties legitimize the hegemony of nation states, like hegemony not in unipolarity, but just like the overrepresentation of nation states as a nation, because treaties have each country recognize each other. The plan is domestic. What's the link?
Well, one, that probably begs the question of the T-interps of us winning a normal means claim about what a ban would look like. But secondly, even if it's domestic, the argument is about the sort of epistemic frame used to justify the plan, right? So yes, you might be right at the level of fiated implications. There might not be a link for the Krauss evidence, but the Krauss evidence is the index.
That's really all I was asking. That's all I was asking. I guess like the last set of questions that I want to ask is how would the negatives sort of theory of like history, technology in the world explain things like Napoleonic France, Athens versus Sparta, both world wars, the Cold War, just great power conflict in general, and how do you resolve it?
Well, so the Duffield evidence does a genealogical analysis of like the history of conflict and says that when humans started creating technology to use in warfare and desiring rivalries, et cetera, that became the root of conflict, right? That humans had a desire to project their desires onto the broader world and instrumentalize them for weird, perverse things. That's why a process of inhumanism that refuses to extend those desires is necessary.
Okay. Good. So the NC on T says that it's important that like countries unanimously consent to a ban on laws. Do you think that that makes sense to read with this inter? Or like certain countries consent, I think. Does anyone have thoughts on that? Well, actually, let's start with what is the negatives T inter?
It's that states is plural, so they can't only defend China.
Yeah, exactly. So a topical app under their inter would be defending 2 or more states, correct? So in that case, do you think it makes sense to, do you think it like is helping the good often for the negatives interp that like bans would require consensus of like treaties party to this or states party to the CCW, if assuming I'm not misunderstanding the card?
Yeah, I think that would make sense.
Okay, why?
It provides a reason why the interp is more true.
Yeah, that's true. It's probably a little bit of marginal more offense for the neg than the AF. But if the argument is that like all of these countries who are part of the CCW, and also feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, if there's a different utility to this that I don't see, that if that's true, then the air interp wouldn't really solve that either though, because their interp wouldn't mandate that you defend all of those countries. Like 2 countries would still be in violation of that. Does that make sense? So their interp wouldn't solve that, since if like their AF was China and the US, it would still not be like the multilateral agreement from the CCW convention. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Like, do you want to give thumbs up if you think that makes sense, or if you have a reason you disagree that you want to share? Okay. So that's one thing to think about. So let's talk about the critique. The 1NC says that the judge should evaluate the AF as a scholarly artifact. What do you think is the reason behind this? So one part of this question is like, why do you think that that's the next framework interpretation? And the other part of this question is like, why did they put it in the 1NC as opposed to waiting until the 2NR?
Well, isn't that the rule of the ballot? Or like the judge's rule?
Yeah, it's like a way of telling the judge how to evaluate the round.
Well, then it makes sense if they put it in the 1NC.
Yeah, why?
Because it like sets up the rule of the ballot debate early.
Right, yeah. So the neg could wait until the 2NR to explain their framework interpretation and like the reasons I think it's better. But something that means that the AF will get all new responses in the 2AR. And since the 1AR is the most time crunch speech and the AF gets the last word in the 2AR, setting up this debate early tends to be more favorable to the negative, put some pressure on the 1AR, means they can fully develop, the neg can fully develop their arguments, etc. Whereas late breaking debates in general tend to favor the AF. So the same is true with like not explaining like competition arguments on a counterpoint that's like questionably competitive. You can wait until the 2NR to do that, but if you have the time inside of the 1NC, then you can prevent that from being a late breaking debate, which can be strategic. Why and then in terms of why you think they chose this interp, I think it's just you want, as whichever side you are, you want to try to exclude your opponent's offense. And so like evaluating it as a prior question about their relationship between humans and machines, or like the human and non-human, is a way of excluding a lot of the AF's ability to weigh the case until they've disproven the links. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, great. So on the case, the 1NC says that one of the case cards is miscut and says that's a reason to drop the debater. It says they say that it concludes the other way. What do you think is a reason to read this as like a paragraph theory argument, meaning just saying in your speech it's a reason to drop the debater, as opposed to like calling an evidence ethics challenge? Like if you were neg and you were deciding which one to do, how do you think, what are things that you would consider when you're making that decision?
There's a risk that you're wrong, so you don't want to stake like the whole round on that, but it could still be an offensive argument.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing is like there's a risk that you're wrong. Like what if the next paragraph actually is consistent with them or something like that, and you don't want to take that risk, because if you stake the round on it, then that's the entire round. Like if you're wrong, you lose it. So that's one thing to consider. What are other things to consider? Like what would be a benefit to staking the round on it, I guess?
The benefit is you could win if you're right.
Yeah, so if you're really confident you're right, and if you're also really confident that your judge is going to see evidence ethics in the same way that you do, then that is less risky, because if you're like 100% sure this card's miscut and that your judge is going to agree this card's miscut, like it's cut in the middle of a paragraph or something, then there's really no risk, whereas whenever you enter a round, there's some risk, but obviously if you all, so those are the main things to consider, is like, is it who your judge is, if you know how they evaluate evidence ethics debates, how confident you are that a card is miscut, and things like that. For cross-ex, Ari starts cross-ex, and they're clearly trying to press on what the alt is and what it looks like. Why do you think they've chosen this line of questioning?
Because it looks like the alt doesn't really have that many like empirical examples, if I'm right. So I think that's a good question.
Yeah, so maybe the alt seems kind of vague. So part of it could just be like understanding what it is that you're ready to debate it. And then part of it could also be trying to press your opponent in terms of making them say what it looks like. So that way you can point out the fact that it's vague or something like that. So it can be both for clarification and for strategic purposes. Yeah, anything else that you all have thoughts on for cross-ex or the 1NC? Okay, great. Then we can start the 1AR. And also, if any of you have questions about anything that we've talked about so far, or questions about things that are happening during the debate, but you don't want to ask in front of anyone, you can also DM me on the Zoom chat and I'll cover them for everyone.
I'm ready whenever you are. You're good? Okay, it's case, starting with the overview, then T, then the critique. Cool. Ban on laws prevents Chinese hard power takeover and autonomous fait accompli both escalate to nuclear war through use or lose pressures. Independently, U.S. power projection solves existential threats from terror to prolific climate change. Extinction outweighs, denies the ability to relate to each other and tech differently. And the neg choosing death by radiation and starvation for billions of people in the name of ethics is genocidal logic. Case turns the K. Automated warfare will be waged through proxy campaigns in the global south before it escalates. Killing black and indigenous people first. Shift to semi-autonomous weapon assaults by maintaining effective deterrence. Reject inserting re-highlightings. We shouldn't have to spend time answering why they misread everything in the app. If they didn't read the cards, if you're really salty, stop the debate. Cooper evidence. Same as Krauss on the cable. Insert there. Also, liberal militarism is good, preserves great power, peace while ensuring global co-op. That was the 1AC circumvention. Just a domestic ban, durable fiat solves. But it doesn't say the word sign, it says the word ban, which means prohibit. The Bartlett re-highlighting is not miscut or uniqueness about tech development. The fact that we don't know how much is developed is due to Chinese repression and secrecy, which is AF offense. The next, no risk of Chinese preemption because US won't first strike. Only 1AC says hedges characterized by restraint. Horowitz says perception doesn't cause war, but our impact is about tech development. Leapfrogging the US. Yes, swarm threat, scary evidence is highlighted to crumbs. Obviously, machine learning will work around a net. Russia does not thumb China's much different, expanding SOI through debt trap diplomacy in Africa, BRI, AIB, etc. AI is just the tip of the iceberg that causes war. Yes, China sees war as inevitable. We've cited multiple white papers, and that general wasn't ostracized. He just retired. They need counter evidence to disprove decades of military doctrine. China rise will not be peaceful with laws. Schifferson doesn't take into account only the plan ensures peaceful rise with effective deterrence. Double turn with the critique. They say China is defensive realist, which sees the world as it is, not as it should be. If they get to 7 reps, we do too. Forsyth is not. The re-highlighting is bad. No deterrence class from space, cyber, or hypersonics is developed by everyone. Laws are categorically different because A, China is leapfrogging, and B, we can't control it with humans. Brands, yes, it's an AF card. It says competing spheres of influence, incompatible with rules-based international order. That's why unipolarity is necessary to deter China. Shadlow, no empirical war and plan solves. It says new tech is why hedge is declining. Talmadge, they just highlighted all the things Talmadge says she disagrees with. Yes, Chinese NFU with nukes, but that's exactly why they first strike with laws, because they have no doctrine on those. Royal says retrenchment, i.e. taking away troops causes power vacuums. That's why hedge is key. The Ochman check says U.S. needs military alliances to preserve hedge. We do. That's NATO. Now, topicality counter to bear flows to be affirmed by singular instances. Why 90 sea bears your height, seeing one bear sufficient bear flows not contain multiple sea condition there and their deterioration. Ban evidence just as a multilateral ban could be through a treaty, but no intent to define ban, which just means legally prohibit. Debate solves arbitrary linguistic intuitions by predictable in terms determined by pragmatic shifts like clash and limits means division of ground is more important. Double turn with the critique, singular in terms of words, use grammar as a hegemonic linguistic technology, reject topicality to embrace diverse relations to it. AF ground and no TVA, no advantage applies to all picks because each state has different geopolitics and laws. Picks move moot TBAs and are worse than plans because negs have generics like NCs and Ks, but AFs have nothing versus picks. The K. Weigh the implementation of the AF versus the alt, debating the process of the advocacy is necessary for clash and advocacy skills outside of debate, and our scholarship is justified by our consequences. Alt is responsible for solvency and uniqueness. Evaluate the AF versus the alt based on the scope of solvency. The alt can't resolve the impacts of the AF. AF is 6-minute disad. Scenario planning is good. Single debate rounds don't affect subject formation, but scenario planning teaches us to disrupt our worldviews when presented with historical context and empirical facts. The K is neither of those. So reject the theory. Impact turns Schwartz and Newell. This debate should not be about our individual relations to tech. It should be about how tech influences international relations. Tech does give us exceptional powers that we wouldn't have otherwise. For example, deterrence, conquest concretely shifted as a result of the atom bomb, and all when I see evidence proves it's shifting again with laws. Permutation do both. If the all can overcome vast technological globalization, it can overcome the plan. Prove to the all it's justified on case the F is aligned with the all diverse relationships detect but not include laws that rely on militaristic human data. We should contingently retool the ontopolitics of design. Materialism is necessary for any movement which requires analysis of how the world currently operates by situating it amidst the course of history. Only the F has historical context, like the century of humiliation and government white papers, to explain desires behind China's rise. They can't explain conflict or why hedge causes peace, which they just dropped. They just said Pyrrhic wars cause environmental degradation because of tech advancements, which has nothing to do with war. The crass evidence, no link in link terms. It's about international treaties that bolster the legitimacy of great powers, which causes proxy wars. They can't explain why hedges led to the most peaceful time in human history. Napoleonic France, Athens versus Sparta, world wars and Cold War were marred by endless inter-power conflicts, which the plan prevents. Only China sees war as inevitable, which is accelerated by laws development, anarchy, dissent. One is Hui says we should embrace indeterminism. One is Cross-X proves that the alt-policy actually embraces a power vacuum that causes war. Great firewall dissent. Only China has a singular relationship to tech. All collapses deterrence, which allows them to globalize their dystopian surveillance state through expanded SOI. That's brands. One is Truly and Triolo proves it says China wants to export the state-centric model of AI globally, which means they'll export biometric surveillance, social credit scores, concentration camps for Uyghurs and Tibetans, and censorship of liberal media and more. At least Western democracies have self-correcting protections.
Okay, great. So how do you think that 1 AR time allocation was? Or put another way, I guess, how would you all allocate your 1 AR time?
I would allocate most of my time to the K because that seems like the most viable negative strategy. So you would probably want to put a lot of offense on that, which I think the 1 AR did.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like you then make the same type of calculation that Ari did, that they think that it seems like they think that they're going to go for the K, and so they spent the majority of the time on the K. Any other thoughts on time allocation? I thought that they're pretty efficient on the case, so that's something that to also keep in mind is ways in which you can not stay like off of and then explain your opponent's argument and then take a lot of words to also explain the response, but also to just assert the opposite of what they say. So, you know, if they say like if the neg says ban fails, then the app can just say ban works and then explain why, instead of saying like off their ban fails card and then making the argument. That's a way that you can like save a lot of time over time because it adds up across all of the different cards. Let's talk about the content arguments on T. How do you think that, what did you think of these, like in terms of the standards? Do you think that there are some arguments that should have been made that weren't, or what did you think was done well, etc.?
I thought they made like a variety of arguments. Like they answered the ban, like the ban just is could, or like pragmatics over semantics. I think they made a double turn on the link to the K and then also no T and then also standard. But I thought it would have been better if I know the 1 hour is really short, so they don't have much time, but I thought it would have been better. Like I think the PIX standard, like about mooting the app is good, but it would have been better if it was implicated more to the different standards that the neg made, or else it might be a little bit too late in the 2 AR.
Okay, yeah, so you think that implicating that so yeah, there's a good job like line by lining some of the arguments that were made, like you said, and then you liked the PIC standard. Yeah, PICs in general, what negative standard do you all think that this interacts with? Implicitly.
Is it grounds?
Yeah, so it's like limits in the ground, like you were saying. And what's the reason for that?
The negative can pick out of country, like single countries as well. So the app could also be able to like specify countries.
Yeah, so exactly. So like on, whole res where it says like you have to defend the whole resolution, the argument is generally like the app can choose any country out of all of the countries that exist to specify, and that explodes limits. So then the reason that picks is an answer to that is because every country that could be an AF could also be a pick, which means that limits is non-unique. And so just a question of whether AF or neg specification is preferable. And then if you're AF, you want to prove AF specification is preferable. And if you're neg, you want to give reasons why neg specification is preferable. Now that's a little bit different when we're talking about T-Plural though, because their interp would still allow you to choose 2 out of like all of the potential countries that exist. And so do you all think that there's like a real meaningful difference in negative ground if the AF can specify 1 country versus 2 countries?
I don't think there's a big difference because you can always say China and then some obscure country that doesn't even have laws development.
Yeah, exactly. I would agree with you. Now, there are arguments to be made against that. Like if you're negative, for example, you would say, well, you would have to choose 2 countries that aren't susceptible to picks or something like that. So you have to choose countries with unifying grounds. You're incentivized to choose big countries. But I think most likely their interp would definitely allow for you to choose China and then just tack on another country, and like choosing 1 country out of all of the countries that exist versus 2 countries out of all the countries that exist is probably not a very meaningful difference. So given that, explaining that as a defensive argument is something that I think is really important on T-Plural. And then it's because T-Plural, both sides have very little offense in general, because of what we just said, like winning, like you have to do 2 instead of 1 versus you have to do 1 instead of 2. It's really hard to win offense on either side for that, because then the offense is just really marginal. And so given that, what do you think is an argument that should be in all of your 1ARs versus T-Plural? I'll give you a hint. It would be a paradigm issue that would put the burden on them to win a large amount of offense, as opposed to just a risk of offense.
Is there reasonability?
Yeah, exactly. So you always want to put reasonability, because T-Plural there's going to be very little offense for both sides. And so like if they get to win by just having like a 1% chance of offense, your job becomes a lot harder than if you make a reasonability argument, which raises the threshold for how much offense they need to win, because you only need to win sufficient defense. And so then all you have to do is prove that 1 and 2 are not that different. You don't have to prove 1 is better than 2, which is a lot easier. So let's talk about the K. So Ari made an argument about how like they are not able to explain things like the centric humiliation and China rise and a bunch of other things like that. What do you think is the utility of making this argument? Like what's the implication of their theory not being able to explain those things?
It means that the app still has solvency.
Yeah, so it makes it harder for the neg to make like arguments about why the links turn the case or something like that, because they don't have like explanatory power for the specific app advantages. That's definitely true. Anything else? Another thing is like similarly, it makes it harder for them to be able to make alt solves the case arguments if their alt isn't able to explain the specific phenomenon or problems that the app is isolated. And it's also just a general reason that perhaps we should be a bit dubious of their theory if it's not able to explain like really consequential geopolitical events. Okay, someone else mentioned that Ari said like a couple things were double turns or links with the K. They said what they want the implication of this to be, but did anyone catch that, or what is the implication of if the neg reads reads an argument that links to the critique they're reading? for the people in my lab, we talked about this the other day.
I didn't catch it, but is it that if the neg is able to sever their representations in round, then the app should be able to sever the link to the K?
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. So that's always something you consider when you're on both sides. So if you're negative and you're reading a K, then you're going to read some case cards. And I'm not saying that these case cards necessarily did contradict in this case, but like hypothetically, let's say you're reading case cards that you think are going to contradict the K you're reading, or going to link into them. You have to weigh, getting these arguments and maybe getting to play it both ways, versus if your K is heavily reliant on links to representations, it becomes a lot more persuasive for the app to say, well, we get to sever our links because you got to sever yours. So that's something to consider. And then if you're AF, I would always recommend that trying to point out or find any contradictions that you can, and then also saying that justifies you, meaning like the perm can overcome any links to the app, or you get to sever them all together or something like that. Any other thoughts on the 1AR? Okay, then you can go for the NR.
Cool. The order will be case, T, then the critique. The order of the K will be like a very short overview at the top where you do not need like a new sheet for, and then just 2AC or 1AR order. Okay, awesome. Is everyone good? The 2AR was too flippy. The 1AR was too flippy. It didn't answer multiple credit words that take other risk of hegemony. One is China. I'm going to go for two important arguments. One is that China is not an offensive threat, and two, that hegemony is already dead. One, China's not an offensive threat. One, Brock flow is negative. The re-highlighting says the context of Chinese viewing wars inevitable is a reaction to the United States invasion, which turns the affirmative, because it says that reasserting U.S. dominance is a greater internal link to China's reaction to attack, which is then a straight turn that was dropped from the 1 and C to the affirmative advantage. Secondly, do not buy their war inevitable claim. It's by a retired war general who's no longer part of the Chinese military planning. Instead, you prefer my Shepardson evidence that this China rise would be peaceful and one of cooperation rather than competition. Inside updated Chinese military planning and Xi's psychology that concluded that China, while wanting to be an international player, has no desire to eclipse the United States. You should prefer my evidence on recency and nuance, because while their evidence is from a person who's literally out of the military, my person is citing evidence from the people who are actually making decision-making calculus within Chinese governance. The secondary argument is that U.S. era of hard power is dead and can't solve one, too many all causes to reinvestigate the United States, China and Russia developing stronger conventional weaponry, more sophisticated A2AD defense strategies, cyber offensive system outpacing the U.S. in space, and hypersonic weapons that can strike quickly regardless of laws means the affirmative is a drop in the bucket. It can't overcome a structural uniqueness issue that which is the re-highlighting of the 1AC foresight evidence. Two, even if they rebalance military position, China is developing a less confrontational approach to via conflict, but rather diplomacy, economic coercion, and new allies to create broader spheres of influence that brand says threatens U.S. prestige, which is the re-highlighting of their evidence. Even if you ban laws, you can't solve the brunt of how China developed its sphere of influence, which is the app is a drop in the bucket because they only affect hard power. Second, thirdly, they have hedge uniqueness backwards. U.S. military dominance is a challenge to structural shift in the world. The military lacks free access to ocean, sea, air, and the U.S. is falling behind in newer confrontations of conflicts like outer and cyberspace, eroding liberal, international, and people faith into the United States. This flips triad and uniqueness for the creative critique is always setting a higher threshold for them to prove reverse causal evidence about hegemony. That's the low evidence, no performative contradiction argument is about controlling the world and projecting human desires, not just a blanket statement of what you misdiagnosed the critique to be. Second is yes, re-highlighting, no time skew. You can re-highlight re-highlightings if you really want to, but creating a disad for reading bad evidence is a unique reason why we should get into re-highlighting. Worst case scenario, you should probably drop them because their evidence is widely out of context. No case turns a disad, which will be more on the critique debate proper. The T debate, no performative contradiction. We haven't made an argument about language being that we need to create diversity relationship towards, but rather made it a relationship to AI and technology. The K.
The what is the valorization of humanistic control over warfare has become the new metric by which cybernetic and imperial domination of the world function. 4. Impact 1 is colonial domination. The F results in endless wars and humanistic interventions under guise of being more ethical. This results in racialized targeting, marginalized populace, which flips impact uniqueness on the case turn scan analysis. B. Human interventions make instability and extinction inevitable. Result in things like World War II and Cold War. That's what it's Duffield. 3rd, military industrial complex. They use the affirmative now. It proves that we're not less defended for potential threats to build up the impetus for new weapons and proxy wars. That has the change between action reaction spirals between great powers causing extinction. That encompasses the affirmative. They isolate a symptom of military industrial complex while we encompass the root cause externally. It refers to the logic of humans as the one that controls the flows of the world, represents environmental degradation and extinction because it makes the world inhabitable. Independent extinction area that goes conceded from one. C. Duffield's lack of impact defense means you should be willing to mean that we both have extinction impacts. That it's just a question of who has a stronger internal link. They say permutation to both. They say Freiberg, our interpretation is the judgment of value of the one he sees called the artifact. They have affirmative defended epistemic orientation, human machine relationship prior to evaluating a risk of solvency. I would have spent a lot of time with Freiberg if I would Freiberg. I would debate because the impactors, the model of deliberation by what the one he was introduced before our interpretation. 1 is solvability. Bell can't pass the path into law, but again, signal shift could be norm proven by team shifting Freiberg from case or cheating it to be get away the affirmative. 2nd is a prerequisite to the offense that takes out the first 2 arguments on Freiberg. Status quo debates are lost, tagging and failed to cause action because there's a lack of adequate evidence. Both sides of the debate are based on hypotheticals and are no more accurate than looking at a crystal ball. The problem is that both sides have wildly different understanding of human robot relationships and subsequently come to different conclusions. Their only interpretation or further political dogma prevents action, which you can flag as an independent presumption ballot. That's one issue towards only our interpretation force an immediate techno-human relationship that creates more efficacious policymakers than better advocacy. So our interpretation force the questioning of those assumed terms of debate cultivates that better class allows for to be able to inject demilitarism and anti-imperialism into the discussion and subsequently or advocacy rejecting their interpretation. The independent also assumption because the more rounds we win, the more we can upset traditional dialogue. Fairness arguments is incorrect. 1 is predictable and not infinitely regressive. 1 is Schwartz evidence solves the ethics for our model debate and hyper-specific what debates under laws limits out on and ought to look like with truth to the core controversy and should be have ground. Our interpretation isn't just reps, but it's a lot more specific about how human-machine relationships ought to be mediated, and it's a filter as a solvency advocate, which means it's predictable. 1 day, secondly, they had infinite prep and choose what is in the affirmative. They should be held accountable for their representations of more fair and fairness as a sliding scale. How much enough risk of defense means that often should outweigh the permutation to vote link is the dissent to permutation. Anything else suffers or ensured with voting age for clash and education makes the AFA moving target impossible negative. I'll do a link here to ban extended laws create the monopoly of rounds where the question becomes who best controls the levers of international coupling, which they best provide cover for the international system. The justificative hedge and the one I see the proofs that a ban is not innocuous, but rather mechanism to return control of conflict. The United States is storming off control of the world is a mutually exclusively alternative forwarding of whether humans ought to preserve that control in the first place. You can't do but banning laws presume that humans have the authority to regulate the flows of text, which we disagree with. You should artificially separate the affirmative and alternative or parallel tracks in order to force maximum clash over the context of the one I see. They're sort of can't explain so it is incorrect because we have given an example of World War II, 1 and World War II where it has happened. All the examples you've cited is proof of why humans desire for more and more power results in more and more conflict, which means that our offense outweighs the evidence. The alternative to the philosophical inhumanism that offer the rupture of the affirmative will to control technology rather than to check as a tool for humanity, a practice of inhuman follows on relationship to technology priors that coexist in one that breeds technology like laws that autonomous and conscious. That's all the root cause of the affirmative. It's the reason why laws are bad in this way is because we've understood them as instrumental tools in human war because they haven't made a utopian fiat bad claim. So if we win the permutation, you can think of the alternative as something we fiat is legitimate. They get attitudinal fiat, so we get to do that was the circumvention debate. No anarchy dissent because we think that would it's both the anarchy dissent and the China dissent both assume a world where the states have power and control over the flows of technology argued by examining a co-inhabitant one we're able to solve the root cause of that, i.e. why would China's militarized laws in the first place, why would the US intervene in the first place, argued by viewing technology not as tools for humanity but rather things that we coexist with. We're able to solve the affirmative while also refusing the demand for human mastery.
Okay, great. So first is, do you think that the NR obviously went for the K? Do you think that that was the right strategy?
Yes, because there wasn't like much offense on like the T, and also I don't think it would be that strategic to just like collapse on the case because there was a greater time allocation and like more cards developed on the K, and the K argument was like more developed than the like case arguments.
Yeah, so one argument in favor of collapsing to the K over T would just be that, like we talked about before, there's not a ton of offense on the shell. And does anyone disagree or have other thoughts? I think that going for the K is a good move. I think that, if you wanted to make an argument for going for T, you could say that, there's some less arguments there, so you might be able to deal with them quickly. And even if there's limited neg offense, if we're agreeing to competing interpretations, then they just have to win some risk of offense. And that might be more possible given there weren't too many defensive arguments made inside of the 1AR. So I think that, there's also definitely a 2NR on T as well. So in terms of the content here, one argument on the critique, they talked about how made arguments at the top, a bunch of impact calculus. What do you, or explaining of their impacts. So what do you think, why didn't they put that at the top? How do you think that helps them in this debate?
I think they're at the top because they're also quite important. There's kind of root cause claims, also how it leads to extinction. So even if they other things aren't entirely clear, these really important arguments are made.
Yeah, exactly. So root cause kind of arguments which are essentially ways of saying that the critique turns the case or means that they're not able to solve their own impacts, and also arguments about the various ways in which the critique would make extinction inevitable. Why specifically do you think it's good for negs to have extinction impacts if they can on case?
I think that was smart because then even under the AF framing, you could probably still win the biggest util impact.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing is that even if they win, the AF wins, if they do get to weigh the case, you still have an impact that matters. And on top of that is a lot of AFs will just collapse to extinction outweighs for the 2AR, just we get to weigh the case and case outweighs because of extinction, and that's it, no matter how potentially dubious their extinction scenario is. And then they just don't even bother to deal with any of the links or perms or anything like that because they just can win on the case outweighs. And this, if you have your own extinction impact when you're negative, then it's kind of checkmate on that strategy, unless they, obviously there's lots of other things that the AF can go for, but just going for any risk of extinction outweighs becomes a lot less viable when the negative also has a viable extinction impact. Okay, on the case page, they did some weighing, evidence comparison for their second card. What was it? And do you have any thoughts on it? In terms of what was good about it or anything like that?
Was this the card with the recency and nuance argument?
Yeah, exactly. Can you explain specifically what type of evidence comparison they did?
They were comparing a previous Chinese general versus the people who are actually making the decisions now.
Yeah, exactly. And why do you think that matters?
Because it's more relevant to current Chinese policy and impending threats from China.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's an example of some, good piece of evidence comparison that you can do, because the people who are currently in power are more likely to be up to date on the current Chinese doctrine or policy. Exactly. Recency is also something that matters. I think, if you want to make a recency argument, you also want to explain why recency matters. So what is a reason that you think that recency might matter in this context?
Because all the uniqueness evidence is built up on China's about to leapfrog the US, so recency claims have major implications because they dictate the status quo relationships and when the internal link will happen.
Yeah, exactly. So recency in general, in relating to political things is important because they're always evolving. And then I would also suggest that when you're doing evidence comparison about why recency matters, not only explaining why in the abstract it matters, i.e. that what we just talked about, that things are always changing, but also giving specific examples of things that have happened in between the date that their card was written and the date that your card was written. So if this argument is a reason for don't buy that war is inevitable between the US and China, then you would want to give examples of things that have happened that would indicate that tensions are decreasing in between the time period they wrote it and the time period that your card's written. And then Ari might theoretically want to do the opposite of that, like give examples of the ways in which tensions have increased, like specific events or things that China has done that the US maybe has perceived as aggressive or vice versa, and why that makes war inevitable. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing evidence comparison. So yeah, just to recap, the thing that your thing is better at, so your card is better at, so like recency or author qualifications or whatever it is, then you want to explain, and then you want to explain why that thing matters. Okay, any other thoughts on the NR? Okay, then Ari, you can go.
Okay. All right. Is everyone good? I suppose it's the case and the critique. Okay. Extinction outweighs and denies the ability to relate to one another and technology differently, and they conceded that letting everyone die in the name of ethics is genocidal logic, which means that if you know that there's a direct impact that causes quick extinction that the affirmative solves for, then you should vote affirmative because you can only die once. The Brock re-highlighting is terrible. It just says that China, that we don't know how much China has developed because of repression and secrecy, which bolsters the perception internal link of our hegemony advantage. They say we cited a retired general. The next line talks about unrestricted warfare that the PLA has been citing in their white paper in 2020, which is why they still view laws as a way to create inevitable war with the United States. It's not just about the one dude from 2003. They say all causes to hegemony collapse. Our argument is that the leapfrogging that happens as a result of laws causes a perception gap that allows other nations to bandwagon behind China. Otherwise, people wouldn't know that the United States is somewhat dragging behind, which is crucial to resolving a bunch of hotspots. Independently, they have conceded that China leapfrogging the U.S. with LAWS causes preemptive nuclear strikes through use it or lose it pressures, which is a unique impact that they have no way of solving through their sort of pause and meditative thought on the critique. They say that we lack access to oceans and things. This is why we have military alliances like NATO, which control China's near abroad, and our alliances like Japan and South Korea, which was the legitimate evidence from them. When I see, yeah, the K. First, framework, you need to weigh the case for any link to be valuable. Our justifications are justified by the consequences of the affirmative, which is why we should be able to justify our scholarship through what the plan causes. IR scholarship should come first. They have conceded the technology might change international relations, but it is not the center of them. For example, there was still animosity between countries before the atom bomb, but the atom bomb changed deterrence paradigms so that people were scared to actually go to war with each other, which is why IR scholarship is a necessary forefront. The case outweighs nuclear war. Nuclear war comes first, and the hegemony stops interventions, which was conceded from the 1AC4 sites evidence. It also stops proxy wars, which was from the Brands evidence, that only in periods of multi-power competition, like the Napoleonic Wars, Athens and Sparta, the Cold War, both World Wars, etc., all of those were characterized by multipolar competition, and all of those were what caused intervention and proxy wars, which turns their impact. We also solves the environment because the Ochemnik evidence indicates that alliances and strong-arming people through hard power is able to create global cooperation over things like warming, which we said we solve all their impacts, but they solve none of them. The K cannot explain history. They can only explain World War II and the Cold War due to the Industrial Revolution. But what about before that, like World War I and the Napoleonic Wars in Athens? Only Athens and Sparta. Only the affirmative solves by having a robust view of history that takes into account interpower conflict. Anarchy dissent was conceded. They cause transition wars because there becomes a power vacuum if China and the U.S. kind of give up through SOCO, Saudi Arabia, etc., who are all developing nukes. They can't just fiat away things like a mindset shift for the same way that they say we can't fiat severing out of the affirmative because it moots clash, which means that they should not be able to fiat anything, and they should have to be stuck with the consequences of their alternative. Lastly, is a great firewall dissent. They have not dealt with the fact that China is seeking power more repressively than the United States. They're choosing to expand their sphere of influence in order to expand concentration camps against people like the Uyghurs, and also just general censorship of liberalism abroad, which proves that hegemony is the most peaceful and most liberal option.
Okay, good. So what did you all think the two areas main strategy was on K, and what did you think was done well, or what do you think you might have done differently?
I think the two main strategies against the K was weighing the case against the K, like extinction impacts, and the second was like explaining that the K has like barely any empirical examples, and it can't like evaluate history.
Yeah, those are definitely two important parts of it for sure. Does anyone have anything else to add?
I guess this is part of like disproving how their theory can account for other issues. It's they made their own like kind of root cause claim about how hegemony is able to stop all these issues, and it's actually hegemony that leads to or is able to resolve them.
Yeah, it's like there was a hard press on like hegemony solves everything. It solves our impacts and it solves your impacts. Good. And why do you think that is useful?
That
Maybe-
means that their alt
No,
is able to have. No, sorry.
Sorry,
That means
you
that like their alt isn't able to solve as much, but it also that coupled with the fact that like their thesis isn't able to answer like other points in history, make that their root cause claim comes before like the other side's root cause claim.
Yeah. Yeah, good. And then I think there's a couple other things, or like one other thing specifically. Anything else on for the K? I'm also about the alt.
I think it was they can't fiat like the mindset shift just to happen, or else it would just moot any clash.
Yeah, and yeah, good. And so that the reason that they are making that argument is they're saying that the alternative is bad because it causes transition wars because of a power vacuum. So you also want to like, so the reason that, this is good is that like, even if the neg is like winning some of their links or something like that, if the AF wins, like the alternative results in like bad things independently, then that's still a reason that the AF can win. In the same way that if like the neg gave reasons why the plan is independently worse than the status quo or something like that. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, great. Now, this didn't really come up inside of the 2AR, but something that I just wanted to mention that was in the NR and the 1AR is the idea of, can we insert re-highlightings? So if you might be on both sides of this debate in the future. So this can be the arguments that the debaters made, or it can just be like your own thoughts on it. What are arguments you would want to make if you were going to say like the app should be able, or whatever side should be able to insert re-highlightings, and what are arguments you would make if you want to say they shouldn't? And just to clarify, it's just so everyone knows, re-highlightings are just you taking the card and then highlighting a part of their card, like your opponent's evidence that you think concludes in a different direction. The question is, should you be able to just put that into the doc for your judge to read on themselves, or should you have to read out loud the part of the card that you think goes the other way? So what are arguments for both sides of that?
An argument for you can just reinsert it rather than reading it is that they're the ones that made the mistake and the violation, and like I technically shouldn't be punished for having to spend time rereading the card for that.
Yeah, good. And that, so it would take away negative speech, or like whatever side you are, take away your speech time for something that you didn't do wrong. And that also means that it would encourage the like whatever side to miscut evidence, because they know that if they do it, then it just kind of like then their opponent would have to waste a ton of time reading all of it anyways, and since they're unlikely to do that, then it just encouraged you to kind of miscut all of the cards in your app, because they would have to spend their whole speech pointing out each of them. So that's an argument for it. What's an argument against it?
I'll just guess. Maybe because it's like a separate argument because you're arguing against the card. So it's like you should probably read the evidence to warrant it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, on the flip side of this is that then the other debater can just claim that like every card in the AF goes the other direction and just re-highlight everything and then have the judge just read it on their own and come to their own conclusions about what the cards say. And then they don't actually have to read cards. They get to make way more arguments. And then in the next speech, even if they know that the re-highlightings they've done are kind of disingenuous or whatever, their opponent still has to go through and answer all of the re-highlightings, which is going to take a ton of their time. So those are arguments on each side if you wanted, which might be useful for you all because you might be on either side or both sides of that debate. Okay, so now if you all want to take a few minutes to write RFPs, and then if anyone wants to share them after, we can do that. And also let us know if you have any questions at all that you want to go over. Okay, does anyone want to share who they voted for and why? Got it, one more minute. Is anyone ready now?
I'm still not done looking over my flow, but my first instinct is F, just because like looking at the K stuff, it seems like it solves a lot of their, they solve a lot of their root cause claims that was made in the 2NR. Yeah, I'm not completely done, but my first instinct is F, because it looks like they resolved a lot of the issues that were on the K.
Okay, great. Does anyone have any other thoughts?
Oh, was there an alt clauses claim in the 2NR that was conceded by the 2AR? It was on case, but like, it's just alt, it was an alt clauses claim, alt causes claim for why US hegemony is like already dead, and I don't see a response for it in the 2AR.
They said, yeah, China is developing stronger conventional weaponry.
I think the 1AR grouped, I think the 2AR grouped the 3 responses to hedge declining and made an argument about leapfrogging, if I'm flowing correctly. That was used as a laws specific warrant that takes out the alt causes.
Oh, yeah, I see. Okay.
I think that was the response.
Yeah, so I mean, if any of you want to share your RFPs or just like general thoughts about the round, we'd love to hear them. If you don't want to, you also can just send them over to your lab leaders.
Okay, I actually voted neg based on like extinction and solving the root cause. But I think that the AF does win that LAWs have unique risks because of like preemptive strike. But the impact to hegemony is like less certain as the 2NR because like there's hard power versus soft power. And then also like China's approach to take over hegemony, I'm like less certain about.
Yeah, okay. So you think that like there's a smaller, there's the neg was able to decrease the risk of the case, but that they're winning a link and like pretty big impacts to the link, and that they're also able to solve it.
Yeah.
Okay. So Holly's, anything from you? Okay, well then thank you all for coming and watching the demo debate. Feel free to message us if you have any questions or anything after.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.